my name is Sarah, and today we're talking about Divergent. If you watched my August wrap-up video, you know that I read the entire Divergent series in the month of August. I fully recognize that I'm like 4 years behind everyone else when it comes to reading this series, but that tends to happen with super popular books because I don't like to read things just because they're super popular. I like to read them because I actually want to read them, and for that reason, I tend to avoid super popular books for at least a period of time until I've sort of assessed, my actual interest in the book, and not just like, oh my gosh, everyone's reading this, I want to read it myself too. Before we really get started, I just wanted to let you guys know some of this might be a little bit spoilery, not too much. Pretty much anything I'm gonna spoil is like stuff you already know if you've seen the movie trailer. But if you haven't seen the movie trailer and you really know nothing about this book and don't want to know, then just stop watching right now. I'll wait. Okay, we good? Good. Okay, so let's get started. If you're not familiar with the story, Divergent is another young adult dystopian novel set in a post-apocalyptic Chicago. The city is divided into 5 different factions, all of which elevate a certain virtue or value above all others. The story follows 16-year-old Beatrice Pryor, who's grown up in abnegation. We join her on the one day each year where every 16-year-old in the country takes an aptitude test to tell them which faction they should be living in, followed by a choosing ceremony where they make the decision to stay in the faction that they were born and raised in, or to move to a different faction that better suits their natural personality. Chances are you've seen the trailer for the movie, and so you recognize that she is divergent, which means she tests into a bunch of different factions and sort of has to decide which one she's going to choose. She winds up choosing Dauntless, which is the faction that values bravery, and renames herself Triss. Over the course of her initiation, all sorts of things happen, and we eventually learn, surprise, surprise, there's a revolution brewing, and by the end of the book, of course, all hell breaks loose. This was my favorite book out of the series. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars and really enjoyed the intrigue and the general premise and a lot of the various themes and philosophical questions that Roth poses throughout the story. Some of the things that I really enjoyed in particular, one is Veronica Roth's pacing. Like, I don't care what you say about her characters, her world building, her whatever, she rocks the pacing element of writing. Whether you love a story or not, you've got to give an author props who can pace a book like she does. Because especially in our modern era, where there's so many distractions and so many different things that are grabbing for your attention, someone who can write a book that will make you sit down and read it in like 4 or 5 hours, pretty much in one sitting, like, that's not easy to do, and she really does an excellent job pacing these books to keep you engaged, to keep the story moving along, but give you some character development, some information that you kind of need to understand what's happening, but never having moments where you're like, oh my gosh, I just need the plot to move somewhere, please, can we please move it? Because as much as I love classic literature, that tends to happen sometimes. Really, like, this book is just kind of the definition of a page-turner. It's very intriguing, the story, the plot. Yes, it's a dystopian novel, and so a lot of people have compared it to books like The Hunger Games, but I mean, the definition of a dystopian story is that it's like a post-apocalyptic kind of situation, so of course there are going to be similarities. Something else that I really enjoyed about this book, and really just the series in general, are the philosophical themes and questions that Roth poses throughout the story. One of the themes that runs very heavily through this book in particular is the question of bravery versus selflessness, which those are the 2 values that are upheld by the faction that Triss was born into, abnegation, and the faction that she chooses, Dauntless. There's this whole question that runs through from the very beginning all the way through the end of the novel. Is bravery better or is selflessness better? And one of the things that Roth sort of poses and lets you ponder on yourself is, are they really that different? Is being selfless really something that is removed from bravery? And one of the things that I think she tries to get across is that very often bravery and selflessness are the same thing, and it is when you are being your most selfless that you're being your most brave, and vice versa. You see that theme introduced and really heavily focused on in this novel, and then continued to play out through the rest of the series. One of the other themes that she sort of poses that I really enjoyed and thought was very fascinating is the question of upholding a certain value over all other values in life. And we see this in a conversation that Triss has with the character 4, where he basically says he doesn't want to be one thing. He wants to be selfless and brave and kind and, you know, knowledgeable and all of these things, and he really desires to be a complete person and not defined by one particular characteristic based on the faction that he lives in. And I found that really interesting because obviously we don't necessarily live in a world where we value, you know, honesty over this or, you know, kindness over whatever, but we do live in a world where certain things tend to be upheld more than others. And in certain areas of life, people are often told they have to be just one thing or they have to choose just one thing. That notion of being forced to sort of live in a box of one thing, I found really, really fascinating and a really interesting and worthwhile discussion to have, especially since this book it's a young adult novel, so it's targeted at, you know, teens and that high school and college age where kids are trying so hard to fit in. I think it's really easy to fall into this trap of feeling like you have to fit into a certain box or you have to place yourself into a certain box in order to be accepted or to be liked or whatever. And one of the benefits of this theme that can be discussed among young people is that you don't have to be. You can choose to be all of the things that you would like to be, and you don't have to fit into a particular box just because someone tells you that's where you have to go. Some of the things I did not like about this book, honestly, the world is intriguing, but there are so many holes in it. Like, we really don't get a good explanation of what being a divergent is or how you become a divergent, or, you know, so there's a lot of like talk about, you know, Tris being divergent and is anyone else divergent and all this stuff, but it's like sort of like, okay, but what does that really mean? Like, what actually is a divergent? And she doesn't really delve into that or explain much of that. It's really just this sort of taboo, oh my gosh, you can't tell anyone or you're gonna die kind of situation. One of the other things that was kind of hard for me about this book is you meet a lot of characters at one time, and I get it that Tris moves to a different faction, and so she meets all of the other new people that are like in this faction and all this stuff, but that made character development really hard. It took a little while for you to really grasp like who was important and who wasn't, and who was from what faction, and therefore why, you know, were they acting the way that they were and things like that. And I understand that there are difficulties in a situation like this where you have to introduce a bunch of characters at one time, but I think Roth could have done a little bit of better job of making it obvious earlier on who was going to be important, who wasn't, and giving you better ways to differentiate between who was who, so you weren't having to so often go, wait, who's that again? One of the things that I was a little bit iffy on in this book is the relationship that develops between Tris and Four. When I was first reading it, I was kind of like, because it very much seemed to me like the relationships that happen in almost every other young adult novel, which is like, oh my gosh, I love you, right away. And while I recognize that 16 and 17 and 18-year-olds are fully capable of loving and loving well, because I know people who've gotten married right out of high school or eventually married their high school sweetheart or whatever, I have no doubt that high schoolers are capable of that kind of love and attachment, but that generally doesn't happen over a course of like 2 weeks. And when I was reading the book, it seemed like the timeline happened over about 2 weeks and everything happened really, really quickly. And upon further investigation and stuff, I realized that this actually happens over a much longer period of time, more like 2 to 3 months, vice, you know, 2 weeks. And at that point, I was a bit more okay with the relationship that develops between Tris and Four. And I do really like how by the end of the book, they were really starting to rely on each other and recognize that they were better and stronger together than they were on their own. So there you have it, friends. That's my review of Divergent. I hope you enjoyed hearing my thoughts. If you've read this story, I would love to hear what you think of it as well, both of the characters, the pacing, the plot development, really anything that I talked about, or any other themes or questions or just other stuff that you noticed as you were reading the story. So please let me know in the comments and we can talk a little bit more about it there. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you next time. Bye! So there you have it, friends. That's my review. I can't say the word review today. What the heck?